This is TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and I'm very, very happy to have with us today Professor Irit Back, Dr. Irit Back. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you. Irit Back is an expert in contemporary African studies, expertise among other fields, Islam and Africa, and even something we'll talk about today, Holocaust in Africa, which is a fascinating subject. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Tell us a little bit about your own academic background. When did you discover that Africa is your area of expertise?
I think it's something that began in my childhood. I love to read books of adventure or discovery of Africa, like Tarzan, and there was a Hebrew book by Nahum Gutman, Lubengulu, Melech Zulu, the King of Zulu, and other adventure books. But the time that I decided that I need to know more about Africa was after my military service. I was working in an absorption center at Afula. I was born in Afula. And it was the first group of Ethiopian Jews that came to Israel. And I worked with them. I taught Hebrew to the children. And I was fascinated by this community of people, they was with self-respect. And I felt that they have a very rich history and culture behind them. And I didn't know nothing. Nobody knew nothing about this community. It was kind of surprise. And then I decided that I must go to learn about Africa. And I came to Tel Aviv University and arrived to the Department of African History, but also Middle Eastern. And my own academic path is combining Middle Eastern and African history, but my first and primary interest is in Africa.
And today you're teaching at the Department of African History.
Yes, for many, many years.
Yes, and so you're describing a process that I'm assuming that every person that was exposed to Africa is going through, right? We go from the initial basic romantic view of Africa as a tribal society, very traditional society, into understanding more of the complexity of Africa, right? It goes way beyond our romantic view of Africa. So what have you learned that you can share with us over the years, that things that we should know about Africa that we don't know?
Yes, we have kind of slogan of Africanists that say that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And people used to think about Africa as a single country and not as 54 countries. And what I learned about Ethiopia, for example, it's very different from other parts of Africa. And I thought about Africa, for example, as tribal and Christian maybe, but not as Muslim. And I found that Islam in Africa is very prominent.
So let's provide our listeners and our viewers with some historical context. So let's say Africa of the last several centuries, who were the foreign players that shaped Africa today? So I know your specialty is the French-speaking African countries, but there were other powers at the time. So give us a little bit of a historical background.
Of course, there are all the colonial powers, especially France and Britain, but also other countries such as Portugal and even Belgium. We used to think about Belgium as, as chocolate and beer. But for a long time, there were exercised very harsh colonialism in Belgian Congo.
I know. By the way, you should know, I have a very large family in Africa, and they lived in Congo, in a town that was known then as Elizabethville, what today is Kinshasa. And then they moved to South Africa, where they still live until this very day. So I'm very familiar with the history of the Jews of Africa, especially Congo.
Wow, it's very unique. But I want to concentrate on the African part of history, on the African view of history. Even when I start to study here at Tel Aviv University, most of the history was written by European. And my view is that I must learn the African view about...
I'll say more than that. Most of the people that wrote about Africa late 19th century never been to Africa.
Yeah.
They used to call it armchair anthropology. Someone sat in London and wrote about a continent they've never been to.
Yeah, and it's still today, most of the conferences that I'm attending are in Europe or in the United States, and still the Africans should claim more history to write more history by themselves. And this is my view, because it's... actually, I read, English, French, Arabic, but... even I myself, I'm not so familiar with many African languages. So this is my claim, but I'm not always following it.
So one of the first things that you would like us to know about Africa is that Africa is complex. It's not just one territorial unit, but rather, a very wide range of cultures and languages and tribes and nationalities and so on. And beyond that, you would say that there was a very strong religious element. Was there a clash between the introduction of religion and tribal nature of those societies? So, for example, when Christianity was introduced, we know it was introduced by force. I don't know what was the case with Islam. What can you tell us about that introduction of religion to Africa?
I think that both Islam and Christianity were in some way absorbed with local religions, local beliefs. And one of my discoveries was that there are today mega churches in Africa. People, like 50,000 people arrive to Sunday ceremony in places like Lagos, Nigeria, for example. And it's very vivid, the Christianity there, but it's some kind of mixture between universal known Christianity like Catholic or Protestant and local beliefs and local tradition and even local religions. And also this is the case with Islam. Islam, it's much more deep-rooted in Africa. Since its beginning, it arrived there. But also Islam, it's some kind of a variation of local and universal. I think it's everywhere the same, but in Africa it's more known, this mixture. And I think that religion is very strong all over, both Islam, Christianity, and also traditional beliefs and some kind of mixture between them.
So you would say that it's a God-fearing continent by and large. So they whatever God they believe in God.
Yeah, I think it's some kind of it's unique. I think that Christianity, for example, while it's declined in other places in the world, in Africa it's just blooming, all over the continent, and so is Islam. And I think that there is something that's really related to the religiosity of the people. People are, inherent religious, but they have their own way of religion that combine their own beliefs with the more universal beliefs.
And I know from my experience in the United States that the what we call evangelical Christianity is having a keen interest in what's happening in Africa. And I know that because many of the broadcast organizations, television and radio stations are operating in Africa. And so it's a place where evangelical Christianity is on the rise.
Yes.
And you mentioned Nigeria. We see the Nigerian pilgrims visiting Israel all the time. I see their buses all the time. At least before COVID, they used to come here in big numbers. So tell us about their reflections of the Holocaust in Africa? What's their Holocaust experience? What's their view of the Holocaust?
Okay, so I have to combine here my own story because both my parents were Holocaust survivors, and the story of the Holocaust, I feel detached from most of my life, because that's why maybe I choose to go to Africa, to another place, to another continent. But I noticed that I'm looking to research and learn about genocides in Africa. And I wonder why this has happened, because, it's very difficult to, I heard the word Darfur, and I didn't know much about it, but I start to learn, to research, to teach, and I wonder what attracted me to this kind of genocide. And my recent research deals with the way that regional organization can mediate in conflicts in Africa. And I recently understand that it's my own background, my own story. For example, I was visiting Ethiopia. In one of the cities, there I saw children that selling books on the street. They sit on a blanket, and I saw Anna Frank in Amharic.
Wow.
Yeah, and I talked with the children. I asked them who is Anna Frank. And they knew a lot about her. And these are children that are not attending school, they don't have formal education. And one of my first thoughts was, what is the relation between Anna Frank and African states or societies? What is the memory of Anna Frank? And I think that my own story, that my mother's story, resembles a lot of Anna Frank's story. She spent most of her childhood years in isolated room, with many old people, but she didn't lose her optimistic view about life, and I felt that there is a connection, and I started to look for other cases. For example, South Africa. I learned that Nelson Mandela, while he was in prison for many years, there was a copy of Anna Frank diary, say that it was, almost torn to part because everybody read it, and he said that Anna Frank was his role model as the victory of human spirit over depression.
So it's a universal message.
Yeah, and he also mentioned when in his incarnation speech, Anna Frank, and even Holocaust studies are part of South Africa curriculum.
So the victory of the oppressed human spirit is inspirational to many African leaders and many African nations, and which leads me to, after all, we are here in Israel, and what did we get wrong about Africa? And I ask this question as a diplomat because, Israelis remember Golda Meir because of the 1973 war, and somehow, tragically, they forgot all the great things that Golda did. Among them, she was the Israeli leader that opened Africa to Israel in her famous tour of African nations when she was a foreign minister. What did we get wrong about Africa? Why? It seems to me that Israel did not fully utilize the potential and did not fully realize how important Africa is for Israel.
Yeah, sure, you're right, but I'm not sure that it's only our fault, because, the 50s and the 60s, as you mentioned before, was kind of honeymoon of the relation between Israel and many African states. But since 67, and moreover after 73 war, Yom Kippur War, most of African states broke up diplomatic relation with Israel, and it was kind of think of maybe national trauma, because we consider them formally as our friend, but and then gradually we returned to Africa. Actually, we never left all together, but I think that the way that we came back or returned to Africa was a little bit more complex than before 73, because I don't think that we have some kind of national policy of foreign affairs regarding Africa. We see just, a country, here isolated country, and not the continent as a whole.
Right.
And now we're struggling to get our position,
it's one
observer position in the African Union, and it's still very complicated. For example, South Africa, which I mentioned before, kind of have an anti-Israeli position in the African Union because of former Israel-supported apartheid regime and so on. So it's kind of complicated relation, and we don't see the benefits of a holistic maybe attitude toward African states and continent.
Right. And that's a common Israeli failure. I don't think that we in Israel truly understand the meaning of strategy. Maybe it has a lot to do with the fact that we have the military experience, but maybe it's the fact that we are objectively under so many threats. And when you're being threatened, it's very difficult to come up with a strategy, with a long-term strategy. But go back to Africa. What do you think we should be doing in Africa that we're not doing? As a continent, you mentioned South Africa. Certainly, South Africa is a central country to the continent, but so is Nigeria. And with Nigeria, we have wonderful diplomatic ties. What do you think we should be doing that we're not doing? In terms of, one thing is develop a holistic strategy. Beyond that,
some of my former students, for example, are living for example, in Rwanda. And they think that maybe the message of Israel should be the export of educational program or experience. Usually we talk about agriculture and irrigation and all this kind, but maybe, we should be we should advance more maybe ideas such as our education, for example, education for disabled kids. One of my students is engaged in a program for children on the autistic spectrum in Rwanda, for example. We have a lot to contribute and also to learn, by the way, not just to contribute, but we have many ways to do, except, for security and security affairs. We have to think more broadly about all kind of domains that we can be engaged. Even I think we don't have enough trade relations with the African states, for example.
Well, one of the obstacles, one of the hurdles is that we have to comply with the American standard. And the American standard is very harsh when it comes to, and rightly so, when it comes to corruption and of course, bribery in Africa. That's why you don't see too many American corporations doing business in Africa, because they simply cannot accept the way business is done. Do you see any chance that this will change in the near future? Well, right now, the Chinese are the dominant trade and commerce and infrastructure force in Africa. Do you see any chance of that changing in the foreseeable future?
In the last summit of U.S. and Africa leaders, recently the American came with a new plan, I think, for Africa, which includes a lot of investment and a new way of involvement in many fields. And I think they understand the Chinese threat, as you mentioned before, because China is involved everywhere in Africa, and they are less cautious about dealing with a country that's
with corruption,
as corrupted and undemocratic. And I think the U.S. understand now that what should be done they didn't do before regarding Africa. Yet, it's just this kind of like Biden period. We don't know what will be later, what will be the policy of the next government in the United States, and there is a lack of consistent vision regarding Africa, both in the United States and here.
And my late cousin, who was a very successful businessman in Africa, and as I mentioned, he was raised in the Congo. He was born in the Congo. And then in 1975, after the revolution, his business was nationalized, and he had to flee down south to South Africa, where he started from scratch and build another business empire. And so he was unfortunately, he died 5 years ago. He was a very astute observer of the African continent. And he told me many, many years ago that the world is observing what's happening with South Africa very, very closely, and it will have an impact on the way the world will view the entire continent. And he said if the investments, especially of the Europeans in South Africa, will not yield results, if the South Africans will not take advantage of this opportunity and turn South Africa into a global power, then it will be a very bad sign for the whole continent. I think the jury is still out about what will happen in South Africa, but where do you see South Africa going from here? Economically, politically?
I think it's very complicated answer, because there was the euphoria of the post-apartheid, the Mandela period of governance in South Africa. Yet now we know that the story of corruption, of lack of infrastructures, of the decline of the many areas of life is very notable all over South Africa. Yet we should also see that, there is a different kind of socio-economic mobility in the South African society, and people that were not just can't vote, but they can't go anywhere, in terms of education and financial opportunities, are doing better now in South Africa. So it's very complex, because you can see the wrong side of the development of the ANC and the South African state, but you can look, if you look at history, you see that it's more complex picture than we see it, just...
Is the Israeli-South African ties, can they be salvaged? Can we save them?
I don't know, maybe in the post-ANC period, because the ANC, the African National Congress, still, I think, have a lot of the former images of Israel as a as a supporter of the apartheid regime, and in this kind of political constellation in South Africa, I'm not sure if they can look at the relation with Israel differently. Although we have a lot of ties with South Africa, of course, but politically, official political stand of the diplomacy in South Africa, I don't see a change coming soon. I'm not sure, of course. But
yeah, obviously there's a lot to be said about the reasons that brought Israel to collaborate with the South African under apartheid. And one of them was the fact that Israel was facing a global economic boycott, and we didn't have too many partners in the world, so we didn't have the luxury of being too choosy. Is there a chance that they will ever get that message, the ANC folks?
I don't know. I know that many people in South Africa are looking forward to political change. That I think that maybe the ANC, done a historic job, and maybe there will be some kind of political transformation, and so I can't say, I'm a historian. I'm not.
Now, it's rare that we have here in this TAU Unbound an expert on an entire continent. So if you can vary from 30,000 feet above, if you look at the continent, tell us where to look at. What are the interesting things that are happening all over the place, countries, phenomena that we should be paying attention to?
It's the youngest continent.
It's the youngest in terms of age?
In terms of age and demography, of course. And
in terms of countries, do you see, for example, I recently developed an interest in Côte d'Ivoire, in the Ivory Coast, which, by the way, they canceled that name. They're no longer allowed to use the name Ivory Coast, only Côte d'Ivoire. So they're loyal to their French heritage.
Yes.
So Côte d'Ivoire is a very interesting country, right? I think it's an up-and-coming player in Western Africa. Tanzania seems like an up-and-coming player on the eastern side of Africa, Madagascar, and so on. Do you see any other interesting places like that?
Of course, Rwanda. Rwanda is a very interesting place, with all post-genocide reconstruction plan. And, she's functioned very well in some kind of places, but not, for example, in democracy. But I think there is a very interesting process of democracy and democratization in many African states. For example, in Kenya, in Ghana, South Africa, of course, even Nigeria, with all its problem, they have kind of impressive process of democratization, yet many countries are facing again coup d'etat, like it was many, many years ago, So also it's mixed, it's not one-dimensional, but I think if you look in process of democracy and democratization, I think young people is part of this process because they no longer want to be part of the old dictatorship regimes of Africa. They want a change. And also I maybe recommend to look about the effect of a cellular phone and all the Facebook and all the Instagram on young people all over Africa, because it's very common to have cell phone, even if you don't have a road in your village, but you still have a cell phone. So you know what is happening everywhere. And people, for example, when they look at the corruption, the election, for example, they can take photo of corruption in election and distribute it in social networks. So this is a huge phenomenon, I think, that we should look at, because it's the effect of, example, cell phone and young people.
So the penetration of cell phone and social media platforms among the younger generation in Africa is very impressive, and very much like the Tahrir Square riots, it does play a role in the political process in Africa. There's no question about that. I think that that we should also consider the fact that there are far more through the smartphone. They can learn a lot about the world. I know that from other work that I do, that the ratio of participation of young people from Africa in international projects using their smartphones is just incredible, and people don't have an appreciation of it. I was involved in a project called "Who Will Be the Next Einstein," where global youth, about 75,000 people, young people, participate in solving a scientific problem online, and many of the participants were from Africa, and they simply used their cell phone. That's a wonderful phenomenon. Well, Dr. Back, such a pleasure to have you with us today. We learned so much about Africa. We learned so much about the unique connection between Africa and the narrative of Anne Frank and the Holocaust, a narrative of resilience and perseverance and the spirit and the victory of the human spirit. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank
and
you.
To our listeners and our viewers, thank you for being with us. Until the next episode, bye-bye from Tel Aviv.